Yanis, what a pleasure as ever to see you.
Pleasure is all mine own. It's good to see you. Good to see
Good
you,
to see you.
mate.
I'm in indeed, comrade. I'm in Tenerife. You're in your. I'm not on holiday. Just before everyone starts yelling at me, you're in your parliamentary office. Of course, you are, amongst many other things, an elected member of parliament in Greece. I just want to start actually with something which people are obviously talking about a lot in Britain at the moment, and this is the Conservative policy of deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, which is a very poor country with a terrible human rights record in Africa. Now, there were several asylum seekers going to be deported. It ended up being narrowed down. There were huge campaigns, legal challenges, and in the end, the European Court of Human Rights intervened. I just want your thoughts, your comments on the policy and what it represents, what you think the government, what's their strategy. And you said you're very proud of the European Court of Human Rights decision. So I just want to hear your thoughts on those things.
Well, on a personal note, awfulness, hideousness seems to be following me around. In the 1980s, I escaped Britain in 1987, 1988, immediately after the Thatcher's third victory, and rushed off to Australia. Now, why am I saying that? Because this awful policy of exporting asylum seekers, refugees, to a third world poor country started in the 1990s in Australia by Thatcher's reincarnation in the Antipodes, that little awful man, John Howard, Prime Minister of the Conservative Party there, the Liberals they're called. They are the ones who started this abuse of humanity, of taking refugees from Australia and shoving them on a Pacific island, Nauru or somewhere else. A policy that is being pursued to this day. And let's not forget that your Tories copied that policy from the awfulness of Australia. But it's not just the Tories. I have to say, as a European citizen, a member of the European Union, that the European Union is not immune to this kind of misanthropy. You will recall that several years ago, the European Union had an agreement with President Erdogan of Turkey to do the same thing with the refugees that ended up on the Greek islands, to return them to Turkey, to have them processed offshore in Turkey, calling Turkey a safe country, even to the Kurds and to the people that were being prosecuted in Turkey, including progressive Turks who were trying to escape Erdogan's regime. And we did the same thing in Libya, Owen. The European Union paid billions over the years to traffickers, human traffickers, instead of arresting them, paying them to construct concentration camps in South Libya, in the middle of the desert, of the Sahara Desert, to incarcerate refugees there before they could get to Europe. So, that policy that began with the Australian Tories in the mid-1990s is spreading like a bushfire and threatening to burn down what is left of our ethical, moral fiber.
Now, in terms of the moment, the Tories' kind of right-wing populist grandstanding, the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson negotiated in the general election, he said it was an oven-baked deal. Mm-hmm. Now, it wasn't quite warmed through, to say the least. They're trying to unpick the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, which I have to say on its own terms is working well. The Northern Irish economy is actually doing slightly better than the rest of the UK economy at the moment, and businesses have adapted. So on those terms, you could say it's worked. It has the support of most elected Northern Irish politicians. But the right wing of the Tories, obviously, this is a big deal for them. I just thought your thoughts on where things stand with Boris Johnson's oven-ready Brexit deal with the Northern Ireland Protocol, but more generally, what you think about how it's panned out.
Well, it was oven-ready, except that he wanted recooked. Because, Boris Johnson is a consummate liar. The way in which he reached an agreement with the EU that Theresa May couldn't, what did he do in order to achieve that? He effectively submitted to a border down the Irish Sea. Because either there was going to be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, or there was going to be a border down the Irish Sea. So he sold out the DUP. The DUP, very stupidly, from its own perspective, it was the longest suicide mission by any political party, what the DUP did, which was to agree to Brexit initially, to campaign for Brexit, and then only to realize that one of the two borders would have to be imposed that would undermine the DUP. So he usurped the DUP. He won the election with his oven-ready deal. And then he decided, okay, now what I want to do is I want to maintain the spirit of discontent over Brexit because it's what brought me to power, to 10 Downing Street. And the way to maintain this animosity between London and Brussels was to keep the whole Brexit fiasco going, to prolong it. And a safe way of doing that was to say, oh, now I'm going to go back on the agreement regarding the border down the Irish Sea. And what he's banking on is that, because the European Union is like a gigantic container vessel in the middle of the Pacific that takes a long time to turn, even when the captain turns the steering wheel manically, the container ship takes a long time to turn. He's banking on this thing dragging out for many, many, many months because he's pushing the violation of the Northern Ireland Protocol through the House of Commons. Then that will have to go to the Lords. The European Union will have to have 153 different meetings at different levels of the EU. So this whole thing is going to be prolonged. The Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail will be slightly placated during this period because he is putting up a fight against Europe. And then there will be some sort of deal with the EU, hopefully from his perspective, close to the election or after the next election. And remember, number one priority for Boris today is to survive the rebellion within his own party. And, stirring up this kind of discontent, Brexit discontent, is part of the strategy for us not to be talking about what we need to talk about, which is the refugees, which is the state of the National Health Service, the way that this by stealth privatization of the NHS is proceeding, the fact that 10, 12 years of austerity have given rise to a new kind of austerity, which takes the form of the cost of living crisis. It's a tried and tested technique for diverting attention from the things that really matter.
So you mentioned the cost of living crisis there, and inflation in the UK is about 10%. So it's the highest now for 4 decades, accompanied with, of course, at the moment, not just stagnant, but declining economic growth. In the last month, GDP has declined in the UK. Now, the Bank of England governor has called for wage restraint. There are strikes planned, for example, rail workers, not just over real terms pay cuts, but over job cuts as well. But the narrative being woven by the Bank of England, by Boris Johnson and others, is that in an era of inflation, workers must not fight for higher wages. You're an economist, of course, amongst many, many other things. What do you say to that argument?
He didn't mind wage inflation when it was the bonuses of the bankers that were going up and the bonuses of the conglomerate directors. He didn't mind inflation when it was house prices in Sussex and Kent and South London and North London that were going through the roof. That inflation was good. It's when workers dare imagine that they may get a pay rise that allows them to put food on the table that suddenly Armageddon is at the gates. Look, it's class war. It was class war during the deflationary period when prices were falling, when interest rates were negative. It was class war then, it is class war now. They're class warriors par excellence, these people. And they will never miss an opportunity to shift the distribution of income and wealth further towards the stupidly rich, a combination of stupidity and wealth. Let's talk a little bit of economics, shall we? Yes, inflation is a very serious threat to the lives of the many. After years of wage stagnation, having prices going up. And by the way, they're not going up by 10%. They're going up by 10% on average. You know, if you're poor, if you're living in rented accommodation, if you get a bus, if you go to a supermarket, one of those that are controlled by oligarchic firms, your inflation rate is closer to 20%. If you live in Belgravia, if you live in Holland Park, your inflation rate is probably around 4 or 5%. If you have a mansion and you're paying a mortgage for it, what's your mortgage rate? 3%, 3.5%. But if you are renting, rents are going up by 20%. So we are not all paying the same prices, and therefore each one of us, especially each social class, has its own rate of inflation. And the rate of inflation for the working class and the precariat is always larger than the rate of inflation for the stinking rich, who may actually be experiencing reductions in prices. You know, maybe holidays in Switzerland are going down these days. I don't know, maybe. So the issue is this. You will hear people like the governor of the Bank of England having this debate between them, between the ones who are referred to as hawks and the ones who are referred to as doves. And the discussion between them is, how hard must they hit labor? Should they hit labor very hard or not too hard? This is the discussion between them. I'm not going to take sides between them because they're both wrong. The reason why we have inflation is not so much that the Bank of England has been printing money as if there is no tomorrow. They have been doing this, but they've been doing this since 2008, and the rate of inflation has never escaped. Why is it escaping now? It's escaping for three reasons, if I may say. Okay, the first reason is that some of the printed money went to the many during the pandemic. So as long as they printed money, it was okay when it only went to the rich. So some of the money has gone to the many at the time when the supply chains were interrupted due to lockdown. So there was a constraint on supply, and there was a small increase in demand by the majority of people, by working class people, by the precariat, because they had a little bit of money from furlough schemes and so on. They were stuck in the house. So that gave rise to increases in transport costs and the cost of energy because of this mismatch between the demand and supply. Okay, that's one reason. The second reason is speculation. Speculation. Because of the increase in the price of oil, let's say, or in the price of shipping a container full of goodies from China to Southampton. Of that increase, and let me tell you that only 20% is due to increased costs. 80% is due to increased speculation. So what happens is this. Speculators see that the cost of transporting a container from Shanghai to Southampton is going up. So what they do is they borrow a lot of money, most of it printed by the Bank of England or the Fed or the European Central Bank, and they go and buy all the containers, the container capacity for the next year. Mm-hmm. And then they restricted supply. They are not leasing it. Why? Because they have invested in the speculation that the price of shipping a container will go up. So the one thing they understand about economics is the way to gain monopoly profits is by restricting supply. So they buy the supply in order to restrict the supply, in order to then sell a little bit at a much, much higher price. So you have transport costs and oil costs and natural gas costs. I mean, in Britain, you noticed that you had this oxymoron, this huge paradox over the last few weeks. You had a plethora of gas. There was natural gas building up in the United Kingdom. There was no market for it. There was no way of transporting it to Europe because the pipelines connecting Britain to the continent were chock-a-block, okay? And there was not enough capacity for liquefying the natural gas to export it with tankers. So you had too much natural gas, and the price of natural gas was going up. That doesn't make economic sense, except if you take into consideration the speculation. So one reason, some money that was printed through furlough schemes was given to the poor, to the poorer. Speculation is the second reason. And the third reason, and that's a massive reason, it's a reason that we really need to focus on, is that 13 years of socialism for the bankers since George Osborne, and harsh austerity for the many. Socialism for the bankers, printing money to give to the bankers, and socialism and austerity for the many created very low levels of investment. Because why would you invest if you are an industrialist? Why would you invest in gadgets, in electric cars, and so on? When you look around and what you see is a mass of people unable to afford a Tesla or a high quality gadget of some. So the businesses, instead of investing the money that the Bank of England was printing, they didn't invest because they feared that the little people would not be able to buy the stuff that would come out of the other side of the production line. So what they did is they took the money to the stock exchange and bought back their own shares. This is why the stock exchanges were doing great. But investment was very low. Now, why am I stressing the importance of investment? Because investment creates jobs, good quality jobs. When investment is low, you have shit jobs, precarious jobs only being produced, exploitative jobs, not good quality jobs, not green jobs. You don't have green energy, and you have high long-term prices of energy because you have not invested in it. And you have reliance on Gazprom if you're in Central Europe and so on. So these three are the elements of our present cost of living discontent, right? And these are all the result of 13 years of socialism for the few and harsh austerity for the many. Now, instead of accepting that, you have the governor of the Bank of England saying, the working class has to make more sacrifices. No, the working class must not make more sacrifices. What our movement, DiEM25, and me personally are proposing is this. If we had the proper Labour government, not Keir Starmer's Labour, but the proper Labour government, what should happen? Three things. Yes, interest rates should go up. I know that wouldn't make me very popular amongst people who just bought houses, with huge mortgages, right? But you shouldn't have bought those houses with huge mortgages. It was a very big, stupid mistake. Okay, and we cannot have the whole of the working class subsidizing your mortgages so that you can make capital gains out of a house when there is a housing crisis. So we should have simultaneously increases in interest rates, because the little people are already paying 6 and 7% interest rates. They don't pay the 1 and 2% of the central bank. So put it up to 3% to arrest asset price inflation. Simultaneously, haircut the debts of the many. Haircut the debts, restructure the debts of the many. Credit card debt, student debt, all those debts have to be just cut. They cannot be serviced, cut them. An unpayable debt needs to be restructured. I mean, a banker knows that. Only a Tory doesn't know it. Tory bankers know it, but they don't speak it because it's against party policy. And then the third thing that has to happen is, I'm not against money printing by the Bank of England. But what I'm saying is that the Bank of England should, the money that they print must go directly into the Green New Deal, into investment, maybe through a national investment bank like the Post Office Savings Bank that used to exist in Britain, like the Green Investment Bank that John McDonnell, my friend, comrade John McDonnell and others wanted to create had they won the 2000 election back then, and have the Bank of England, together with the National Investment Bank, fund green investments. That is the way of containing inflation while at the same time promoting the investment that hasn't happened in the last 13 years. But for that, you need a radical, progressive, socialist Labour Party, the one we don't have ever since Keir Starmer has taken over the asylum.
So on that, whilst, by the way, just so people are watching, my camera has decided to go kaput, which I will fix whilst Yanis answers the next question. My camera, in a way, is a metaphor for the current Labour Party, which is decrepit and not fit for purpose. So my camera kind of reflects the current state of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer. Now, it strikes me, I'm just interested in your take on Keir Starmer right now. There's one of the funniest articles I've ever read in my entire life, a news article for The Guardian. The headline was, "Stop calling me boring, Keir Starmer tells shadow cabinet." He's been briefed to Gates by his own shadow cabinet colleagues as boring. Keir Starmer has urged his shadow cabinet to stop briefing the press that he is boring. But then it says, several of those around the table then echoed their leader's call for unity and discretion in a lengthy exchange described by one shadow frontbencher as ironically, very boring. Now, that's funny on every level because obviously they've, again, briefed against him and called him boring. I think the point I was making there is, but my view of Keir Starmer is I don't think he believes in anything. He's surrounded by people who do, right-wing ghouls who don't have any vision other than defining themselves against the left. And they're a hungry crocodile, the Labour right. And Keir Starmer's made his bed with them. And now they've decided he's outlived his purpose. The left have been marginalised within the Labour Party. And now they think, well, he's a dud. We can just replace him with a true believer, a hardcore Blairite instead. Look, I mean, that was obviously me. That's me and my own diagnosis. But I'm just interested. What's your view of whatever Starmerism is? Is Starmerism a thing? And what do you think? What do you think about the current trajectory of the Labour leadership and what's going on within the Labour Party?
I can easily imagine Keir Starmer standing in front of his mirror in the morning and saying to the mirror, be spontaneous, be spontaneous. That kind of, paradoxical character. Look, I don't know the gentleman. I have to say I wouldn't want to meet him. And I'm saying that with a degree of spite because of the way he's treated his own comrades. He was a member of the shadow cabinet under Jeremy Corbyn. He has vilified Jeremy and others. He has made a project out of dividing the Labour Party, of introducing an atmosphere, a climate of repression. The way in which he dealt with the very real anti-Semitism issue, the way in which he has threatened with expulsion anyone who questions the mandate or the belief that there has to be a final victory for Ukraine, one that sees Vladimir Putin being dragged through international court. And if you don't believe in that, then you are threatened with expulsion from the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn, who was accused, together with Momentum and what was called the extreme left or progressives, people like me, he was accused for creating a culture of intolerance, which was completely untrue. Yes, there were some people around Jeremy who had rather authoritarian attitudes, but under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party was the epitome of a democratic broad church compared with what is now the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. But the main criticism I have, besides the ethics and the climate that I sense within the Labour Party, which is suffocating for socialists, and that was his intent. The main criticism I have is that he has rendered the Labour Party utterly neutered vis-a-vis the oligarchy. He has removed all the parts of the Labour Party manifesto that were offensive to the oligarchy. And what he has been left with is a set of policies that are playing the role of a petition to the oligarchy, saying, you can trust me. If I get elected, I will do whatever it takes to help the working class, as long as not one of your privileges is touched. Essentially, I will do nothing to help the working class. I will do nothing to help the many, unless I have your consent. This is his message to the oligarchy. That's why he was embraced so warmly by the oligarchy and the press, the media that the oligarchy controls. And now you're quite right. He has neutered, and sanitized the Labour Party from the perspective of the oligarchy. He doesn't have what it takes to enthuse the masses. He's not a Tony Blair. He's not a charismatic leader. So now they can easily put him in a dustbin where he belongs.
Now I'm using my dodgy laptop camera, but I can still see you, so that's what matters. Just moving on to Julian Assange, because you've been very vocal in supporting Julian Assange. He faces extradition to the United States. Just tell me again, why is this case so important? Why is it so important, not just for the left, but actually for journalism as well, for genuinely independent journalism that can scrutinize power? So just tell me kind of briefly, why should people take a stand on this right now?
Well, because first they come for Julian, then they will come for you, Owen. If you publish something that embarrasses the powers that be, there will have been a precedent of someone whose only crime has been to publish truths that were leaked to him that are embarrassing the great superpower. A great superpower that for the first time will have been granted by the United Kingdom, the judiciary and the government of the United Kingdom, the right to essentially scoop up and arrest and apprehend in the same way that they did after 9/11 with anyone they felt like, to rendition them to Guantanamo. They can do it to any journalist around the world, to anyone who embarrasses them. The only reason why they're hounding Julian Assange was because of those videos that came out of Iraq and Afghanistan, showing to us in the West, in full technicolor, maybe black and white, the crimes committed against humanity in our name behind our backs. That is the only reason why Julian is being persecuted. Now, it so happens that I had noticed Julian Assange's work and writings before WikiLeaks was a thing. And I have to tell you, Owen, that I was reading some of his early work. I became a fan, and I became a fan. Why? Because when I was 12 or 13, something like that, my mother made me read 1984 by George Orwell. and I was aghast because I could see that is the world that we are going to have to live in, because technology was always going to create circumstances whereby the oligarchy, the big brother, whatever, through surveillance, would make us completely transparent while keeping himself, the big brother, totally opaque. And when I was reading Julian's work before WikiLeaks became well known, he gave me hope, because he explained how we can use Big Brother's technologies, especially the internet-based technologies, in order to create some digital gigantic mirror that we can turn towards Big Brother, and we can watch him watching us. And then he did that. And you have one thing that most people do not realize is the technical competence behind WikiLeaks. Have you wondered how it is that the CIA, the NSA, the powers that be around the world have not managed to bring WikiLeaks, the website, down? They can't do it because the only way of bringing WikiLeaks down is if they shut down the whole of the internet. Now, that takes immense expertise. So somebody with that expertise who chooses to embarrass the powers that be and put himself in harm's way, that's who Julian is. He is a very frustrating person. Look, he's a personal friend of mine. I have to tell you that I have huge rows with him, huge disagreements. He really can get on your nerves. But I say that, right? And I have the right to say that. I think he wouldn't mind me saying that. He knows that there were many times when I wanted to throttle him. But make no mistake, folks out there. The only reason why he has been imprisoned for so many years without having been convicted for anything, the only reason why he's been vilified, the only reason why he was not allowed to go to Stockholm to answer the questions about sexual assault, rape, and so on, is because he embarrassed the powers that be, the people who commit crimes on our behalf behind our backs. This is why it's so important that he's saved. They come for him so as to come for you immediately after that.
Now, I'm in Spain, so I want to ask you just quickly about the situation here. Now, I've been writing a book for too long, as my editors can testify, and it had a whole chapter on Spain. And in Spain, I wrote at length. This was wasn't that long ago, 2018. I wrote at length about Spain as an exception because Spain didn't have a mass far-right party. Inigo Errejón and Pablo Iglesias, looks a bit like me, as often been said. But anyway, but they often told crowds at the time that, that the mass movements of Spain, beginning with Indignados, had kind of immunized Spain against the far-right party.
And that was right.
But it isn't anymore. Vox, of course, is a far-right party which is almost leading the opinion polls in Spain. I mean, it's on 23% or so. Not far, because it's fragmented. Politics is fragmented here since the two-party system collapsed. But they are doing extraordinarily well. It's not, you can imagine a government with both the PP, for those who don't know, the Conservative Party in Spain, and Vox. That's a possibility. So I'm wondering, what the hell happened in Spain, do you think? And Podemos, of course, are in government. Yolanda Diaz is, I think, someone who, she's got a very charismatic presence. Lots of people think she's got a big popular base. So my two questions are, what the hell happened with the far right? And do you have hopes for Podemos to stage some sort of recovery?
It's a very painful question for me. Look, Podemos and Syriza, the party I was a member of, not a member, but I was allied with, and we won the elections in 2015. We were sister parties, or brother parties, or whatever, fraternal parties. And we were both parties that were created out of the indignados in Spain, in the piazzas, in the squares, people who didn't belong to parties, or hadn't belonged to parties, getting together to oppose the austerity programs after the great financial collapse in Spain and in Greece. And it was in parallel, and it was beautiful. I remember back in 2011 when we had something like 100,000 people here outside my office where I am today at Syntagma Square, and there were similar demonstrations happening in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Valencia, and so on. It felt that, the prospect of changing Europe and the world was not completely far-fetched. And what happened in Greece, I'm not going to go into this. The party that emerged out of that Indignados movement effectively surrendered, and that's why I resigned, and I'm now, in another party, a small party that is trying to revive that spirit of that period. In Spain, the Podemos, our comrades there, were dealt a major blow by what happened here in Greece. Let me remind you that in July of 2015, when my until then comrade and friend, the Prime Minister of Greece, Alexis Tsipras, we were together in government, in the end surrendered to the austerity program of the Troika. And I resigned. Since then, we haven't spoken. The Prime Minister of Spain, of the People's Party, Mr. Rajoy, remember him? He comes out of the meeting of the European Union Council in which Tsipras signed the surrender document on the dotted line. Rajoy came out. It's worthwhile looking for that since you're writing a book. Find that video on YouTube. When he comes out, towards the end of July of 2015, he comes out in front of the Spanish television cameras, and he's holding that piece of paper that Tsipras had signed. You know what he said? He did this, and he said, "This is what you get if you dare vote for Spain's Syriza," and he meant Podemos. So we Greeks, progressives here in Greece, are partly responsible for the major blow suffered by Podemos. That's 50% of the responsibility. The other 50% belongs to the leadership of Podemos. Because immediately after that, those of us who did not surrender here in Greece, we tried to have a discussion with our comrades in Podemos and warn them against siding with this surrender over. And we tried to do something which I thought was essential at the time. Back then, in 2015, Podemos were around 26% of the vote. They were on the verge of replacing the socialists as the major center-left or left progressive party. They could have done it. But there is a plateau, around 20, 21, 22%. Beyond that, to get there, you've got to be able to answer the question that the middle-of-the-road voter somebody who is not particularly political or Marxist or left-wing, whatever, comes to you and says, okay, mate, if you win government, and if you're the finance minister and you go to the Eurogroup, you go to the Minister of Finance, to the grouping in the European Union of finance ministers, or you're the prime minister and you go to the European Union Council, what are you going to tell them must be done at the pan-European level? What should the European Central Bank do? What should investment be like? You can't just say that we want another world and another Europe. You've got to be more specific. So we try to invite them, Pablo, Iglesias, Errejón, all our comrades, to come up with a pan-European left-wing Green New Deal that would be the program for us here in Greece, for them in Spain. So we'll be able to answer a middle-of-the-road voters' questions, pertinent questions. What should they do at the European level, at the Spanish level, at the regional level? And they were not interested. We were trying to convince them to run together with us in the 2019 European Parliament election with one agenda, and it was impossible. Because the reason is, Podemos within their ranks, they had anti-Europeans, people who wanted Spain to do a Spanexit, to get out of the euro, out of the European Union. They had other people who were far more pro-European. And in the name of some epidermic unity, they chose not to have a European policy. And I was telling them from back then, I'm sounding like someone who wants to say, I told you so, but I apologize for that. But that was my great fear back then, was that once you reach a plateau out of the indignation, then to proceed to forming a government and being the one that leads a government, not to be the junior partner in a social democratic Labourite government, as they became in the end, you've got to have a pan-European perspective, and they refused to do that. The result was that the socialists were given a chance, the Social Democrats, the PSOE, they were given a chance to recover. They had a charismatic leader, there's no doubt about that, quite smart politician, as it turned out, and they turned Podemos into the junior partner. The moment you enter as a junior partner, you can only affect marginal change. You cannot change the austerian policies that are imposed by Brussels upon Madrid. You don't have the Ministry of Finance. Our comrade that you mentioned has the Ministry of Labour. It's not the same thing. The Ministry of Finance is the one that determines austerity, and then the Minister of Labour has to look after the wounded workers with, like a nurse, but not to be the doctor that actually implements a different therapy. It's not a very good metaphor, but you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So in the end, they are no longer that party that carries the wrath of the people out there, that can contain the wrath and convert it into progressive energy. That's the opening of the fascists, the opening of Vox. We could say, we were warning our comrades of Podemos back in 2016. If you do not have a radical pan-European agenda, then there will be a radical right-wing party that does. And this is the result.
Before I ask you about Ukraine, finally, I want to ask something hopeful, and that's France. Now, the French left were being written off only a few months ago. It seemed as though there was a huge existential crisis afflicting the French left, obviously very fragmented. And the far right had made big inroads, actually, quite depressingly, including amongst younger voters, which is not something which is the case in some other comparable Western European nations. In France, the far right actually have a particular purchase amongst younger voters. But what's happened since is after the debacle of the first round, of course, of the French presidential election, when a divided left allowed the far right to make it into the second round against Macron, they got together, they created a united left front, and they came narrowly top in the first round of the parliamentary elections. So what do you think the lesson? I mean, there's an obvious lesson there, I suppose. But one of the things I thought was what's happened in France, which is actually quite unique, I think, is the so-called centre-right have not just accepted the radical left as legitimate political actors, which they don't in Britain. In Britain, they see them as mortal enemies to be crushed, but actually have accepted them as their leadership. Like the centre-left have accepted themselves as subordinate in a coalition in which the radical left are dominant. That strikes me as quite a unique situation. I don't think there's any modern comparable situation.
Quite so. It's happened to some extent here in Greece, because the radical left party, Syriza, that I was party of, did exactly the same thing. It won government on the basis of a very radical agenda, then did a surrender, flip-flopped. But in the process, it eliminated the center-left. The equivalent of the Labour Party, the Socialist Party, the PASOK Party, became the third party, and a distant third at that. And now there are attempts to essentially for the Syriza party to co-opt the socialists. But look, your question brings out the importance of electoral systems. What happened in France now, by the way, I completely support Jean-Luc Melenchon. I've had my disagreements with him, but I congratulate him for putting together this coalition. He's got the support of my party and the movement I belong to. It's essential that on Sunday, all French voters come out and progressives vote with both hands, as we say here in Greece, for the Melenchon coalition. So I needed to preface what I'm saying with this. But it is a creation of the electoral system. You've got a strange kind of first past the post in France. It's not exactly first, it's not like Britain, because there are two rounds. In the first round, the first three go through. Not the first two, but the first three in parliamentary constituencies. Which means that, however, had the France Insoumise, the Melenchon Radical Party, the Communists, the Socialists and the Greens contested them separately, they would get no seats between them, maybe one or two out of 570, however many there are. So the electoral system forced them to get together. And it's not, and it is because it's not first past the post, like, a fully fledged true blue first past the post. If it were, then Melenchon's party would not do well. So it's this mixture of first past the post and a bit more of a proportional system that allowed for this coalition to happen. Now, what really worries me, however, and I have to tell you this, is that if they don't manage to disrupt the dominance of the National Assembly of Macron, if they don't form a majority, if the left does not achieve a majority, which I don't think they will, I very much fear that the day after the elections, this coalition is going to fall apart. And it will fall apart because they don't see eye to eye almost on anything except the need to get elected. If you look at the former Socialist Party and their position vis-a-vis austerity, they're completely fully fledged Austerians. They're not against austerity. They are totally pro-NATO. Melenchon is very skeptical of NATO and adamantly opposed to austerity. The Greens have a different agenda. The Communist Party, I never understood what the French Communist Party stood for in the last 10 years. They always confuse me because whoever I speak to gives me a different story. So the whole thing is not going to, if we're having this conversation 6 months from now, I don't think there's going to be a left-wing coalition that will have survived. I hope it does. I hope I'm wrong. But they would have survived had they won, because then they would have managed to impose Jean-Luc Melenchon as the prime minister, who would be essentially undermining Macron's policies. There would be this kind of difficult cohabitation, which would be great fun for all of us. I believe in disruptive politics, disrupting the capacity of the bourgeoisie to effect class war against the many. That would be brilliant if we could do it.
Just quick on the French Communist Party, one of their main planks, I'm sure you know, was to increase meat production in France. Truly bizarre. Just finally, Ukraine. So, in fact, this is your pinned tweet, so it's a very succinct summary, of course, of your position. The only issue today should be to stop the war and to secure the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. The only way that could happen is a Washington-Moscow agreement that Russia withdraws in exchange for a commitment of Ukrainian neutrality. Anything else is warmongering. So, obviously, we're now, June. So we're about 4 months, well over 100 days, of course, into a horrific war, which has killed tens of thousands of people, of course, from Ukrainian civilians to working class Russian soldiers who've been thrown into a bloody cauldron. I'm just wondering in terms of your view at the moment, because I was interested. I interviewed Noam Chomsky about this a few weeks ago, which caused a big uproar. People actually completely misconstrued what he said, I have to say, because he supported, for example, arming Noam Chomsky. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I thought you misheard. Sorry, misheard what I said. He supported arming Ukraine for self-defense, but people ignored even that position. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your position, I mean, take NATO. I mean, if there was a referendum in Britain, I would vote to withdraw from NATO. I mean, I don't support NATO. The position, I suppose, a lot of Eastern Europeans, including Eastern European leftists, like Polish leftists and others, will say to people like myself is, you're correct that when we look at Western imperialism, the horrors of Iraq, of Libya, going back Vietnam, but generally the global economic system rigged in favor of Western powers, that global power, that particular evil is understandable that you would focus on. But from their perspective, they think, including people like myself, fail to grasp that in Eastern Europe, there is a genuine fear, historically grounded, of Russian domination. And that's driven lots of those people to end up in a position of supporting NATO, a position that neither you or I have. So I'm just wondering, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of how this horrible conflict is resolved, given it is a war of aggression waged by Putin's regime, what, in terms of, if there has to be a peace settlement in the end, what do you think, though, of a position of supporting arming Ukraine so it ends up in a more advantageous position? And in terms of neutrality, given the statements of Putin and his colleagues, Medvedev and others, it does suggest that they're driven by greater Russian chauvinism, that the talk of NATO seemed to be something of an excuse, but actually they are trying to annex large parts of Ukrainian territory in a neo-Tsarist project. So I'm just wondering, that was a lot, sorry, but that's the kind of general, where are you at the moment on Ukraine?
There are three different conversations, and they're all interesting, except that one of them is the most pressing. The most pressing conversation is about how to achieve peace, an honorable peace, a peace that allows Ukraine to build, for the Ukrainians to live peacefully, democratically, and in a sustainable way. I think that is the most pressing question. The other two conversations are theoretically interesting. One is, for instance, what was the real reason why Putin invaded, and to what extent can we blame NATO's expansion for that, or would it have happened anyway? This is an academic question. I spent decades being an academic. I'm not against academic questions, but I think we have a moral responsibility to address the pressing question, not the academic question, at this very juncture. And there's a third conversation, which I have to say really pains me. It's caused me a lot of almost depression and suffering. This is the accusation by left-wing comrades in Poland, in Eastern Europe, that I am personally, I've been accused of being a West-splainer, the Western version of the mansplainer, with arguments like, you deny us agency, what right do you have to have an opinion as to whether we should be members of NATO? This is very painful, primarily because I'm an internationalist. And by that, I mean that, I want Poles and Czechs and Ukrainians to have a view about what's happening in Greece. And I would never say to them that, who the hell are you to tell me what we should be doing in Greece? That's what it means to be an internationalist. And to be shut out of a discussion about what's happening in Eastern Europe because I'm not an Eastern European, is something that gives me pause and a lot of heartache. But forget that. Let's concentrate on what really matters, because there are people who are being killed today. And what we have is we have a monstrous egging on by the United States of America. Putin is a war criminal. I've been saying this, my friend Jeremy Corbyn has been saying that. I remember, 2001, Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Benn were demonstrating outside the House of Commons against Putin for Chechnya. And I was in the Senate of the University of Athens at the same time, being the lone professor in the Senate of the University of Athens, voting against giving Putin an honorary doctorate. So nobody needs to school us on the criminality of Vladimir Putin, right? And I'm so pleased that the Ukrainian army has given him a bloody nose, that he had to withdraw from Kharkiv, he had to withdraw from Kiev, that his progress, in inverted commas, progress in the Donbass is really very slow and painful, that he had gunships being sunk in the Black Sea. I'm very, very pleased for that. The last thing I would have wanted would be for him to walk in there like he walked into Chechnya and kill tens of thousands of people, unopposed by the West, by local defenders, fighters, and so on. But the question now is, how does this end? I mean, you posted. How does it end? And the tweet that you kindly read out, which I tweeted on the first day of the war, I think still stands. We need to have a Ukraine that is sovereign, democratic, within at least the territory that existed, that it had before the 24th of February. So the number one priority should be the Russian troops to withdraw to where they were before the 24th of February. Maximalism at this point, to say that we should never have a peace deal with Putin, to say what Joe Biden so recklessly said, that we should drag Putin through some kind of international court. Which international court? The one that the United States has not endorsed. The one that Russia will have to accept in the National Security Council of the United Nations so that it is instituted. I mean, this is just madness. And who's going to do that? Are we going to fight until the last Ukrainian? I mean, we the West, resemble the United States before Pearl Harbor. You know, they were arming the Brits, they were arming to some extent the Soviets and so on, but they didn't have skin in the game before Pearl Harbor. There is something seriously unethical saying to the Ukrainians, you go and exact a final victory out of Vladimir Putin and drag him through the international courts. It is not impossible that Ukraine can win a final victory if they are prepared to do what the Mujahideen did in Afghanistan, to have a 10-year war, a war of attrition, a total war, whereby, at some point, Russian society rebels against Putin. They're depleted of, fighting men and personnel, like they were in Afghanistan back in the 1980s. It is not impossible. But is Afghanistan a role model for Ukraine? Because if we do that, if we allow this to happen, by the time it all ends, Ukraine will be a wasteland. Hundreds of thousands of people will have died. And I very much fear that the Russia that we will have then, once Putin is toppled, is not going to be a better Russia than the one we have today. It's not going to be the strongman who will, kill and replace Putin. Is not going to necessarily be a Democrat or a liberally minded, pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian person. It could be somebody far worse or just as bad. So to me, what is important is to continue defending Ukrainian territory, to continue the struggle on the ground, while at the same time, Joe Biden picking up the phone and calling Putin and saying, let's talk. Here are elements of a deal. And let me just very briefly describe what I would say. Okay, you need something that you can call a victory, Vladimir. So we agree that NATO will not expand into the Ukraine. You agree to withdraw your troops to where they were before the 24th of February. We agree that there will be a negotiation at the United Nations for Crimea that will take place in 5 years from now. So you kick Crimea into the long grass, because there's no way that Vladimir Putin would accept to have a discussion of Crimea today. And remember, that was not the discussion on the 24th of February. Regarding the Donbass, which is a very difficult place in terms of multi-ethnicities, of different local interests and local oligarchs, different parties. It's very much like Northern Ireland, the Donbass. So what about a Good Friday-like agreement for the Donbass, which is guaranteed by the European Union, like the Good Friday Agreement was, by the Americans, like the Good Friday Agreement was, by Moscow and Kiev? It is possible to give him a way out, continue the pressure on him through Ukrainian resistance, and at the same time give him something that he can take to his generals, to his oligarchs, to his public, to his inner circle, and portray it as a victory. That to me would be a kind of development, a peace treaty, an agreement that would leave everybody dissatisfied, but which would be optimal from the perspective of humanism, of saving the most lives and allowing Ukraine to become something like Austria was during the Cold War. A country which is closely linked, a democratic country, which is closely linked to the rest of Europe, even maybe become a member of the European Union, but not a member of NATO, not a country that stations American troops or nuclear weapons.
Just very finally, it's kind of linked, it's a bit sensitive, but Paul Mason is someone both you and I have known for a long time. He's done some excellent journalism in the past, including he did in terms of obviously very much came to prominence in lots of places because of his coverage of the crisis in Greece, actually, and the rise of Syriza, but also, lots of social issue journalism, social justice issues in Britain. Now, I don't even know what to say, really. There's been this big controversy involving allegedly leaked emails, which I should say he hasn't confirmed or denied, which show him mapping out a kind of mind map of British left organizations and how they're interlinked, and suggesting a kind of pro-Putin web in which certain organizations and individuals need to be deplatformed and targeted, and allegedly approaching the British Foreign Office's counter disinformation unit. It's caused obviously a lot of anger and horror, I think, and shock. Again, he's not confirmed or denied. He's refused to confirm or deny what's happened, and has argued that he's a victim of Russian state actor linked kind of attack, I suppose. I just wondered, what's your general take, Yanis, on what's happened?
One of the things that makes me lose my will to live is the civil war within the left. Ever since I was a very young person, I remember stories that my father was telling me of things that were happening in the 1940s and 50s that involved this kind of civil war. And also some members of the party, of the left, who would, at some point, appear to be targeting comrades. Now, I do not want to be party to this civil war. Paul Mason is somebody I've known for years. I've had him in this building. We've worked together. We've cried together over the austerity programs here in Greece. We had a major disagreement at the end of my tenure in the finance ministry because he supported Tsipras' surrender. He thought it was the only thing that Tsipras could do. I thought it was unforgivable what Tsipras did. So we had a polite disagreement. The only reason why I'm answering your question is because I read those emails. And if they are valid, if they are true, we have the odious in pursuit of the contemptible. Because to map out your comrades in a manner reminiscent of how the NSA and the CIA maps out subversives who are creating problems for the powers that be. Those very maps with Jeremy Corbyn at the center as somehow, the linchpin of the pro-Putin propaganda. I only had to look at that because I know Jeremy, okay? I've criticized Jeremy, he's criticized me, but we're mates, right? Like I've criticized Julian. But one thing I know is that Jeremy is not pro-Putin. As I said before, in 2001, we were demonstrating against Putin. It reminds me of, you remember some Trotskyites back in the day when the United States under George W. Bush were invading Iraq. There were these former Trotskyites, including some very good comrades, some, Christopher Hitchens, for instance, a fantastic man, a man whose work shaped my thinking, who actually supported the invasion of Iraq and vilified those of us who didn't. Now, Christopher, I would like to think, was never part of a shadowy attempt to deplatform anyone. But if Paul Mason has been part of an attempt behind the scenes of deplatforming comrades like me, we had disagreements, so what? I would never deplatform Paul Mason, or anyone for that matter. I would never create a mental map where I would, position my comrades, whether I fell out with them or not is irrelevant, as agents of the devil incarnate living in Moscow, especially when it's so untrue. That kind of practice is one of the few things that make me want to run into a cave and not appear again. There aren't many things that give me that feeling, because I'm a very gregarious person. I believe in politics. I believe constantly in being on the street, in meetings in parliament with people that I disagree with, having fierce debates, especially with comrades. But this underhanded mapping along the lines of the intelligence services practices, your comrades, as I said, it's the hideous in pursuit of the disgraceful, the contemptible.
Well, it's a sad note to end on, but we've covered a huge amount of ground, and I think that was as eloquent as ever. But honestly, Yanis, thanks so much. We talked about so many different issues across the world, so many pressing issues facing the left, the Labour movement, and the general struggle for the different sort of world that both you and I would prefer. But I really, really appreciate it, Yanis. So thanks for joining us as ever.
Well, thank you for doing it, Owen. Thank you.